Jack sat quietly by the campfire, watching the flames flicker and dance against the dark sky. The forest around him was silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant sound of strange creatures in the night. He had been traveling alone on this alien planet for weeks now, far away from Earth. The stars above were different, unfamiliar. The trees around him were taller and thicker, with leaves that shimmered in shades of blue and silver. Jack had grown used to this strange world, but the loneliness still crept up on him from time to time. His worn backpack sat beside him, and his trusty knife was within reach. He hadn't used it in days, but it always made him feel safer. As an ex-soldier, Jack knew how to survive in the wild. But this planet was different. It was beautiful, yes, but also dangerous in ways he couldn't fully understand. He didn't mind the dangers so much, though. It was the silence of being alone that gnawed at him. That's why he had left Earth in the first place, to escape the noise, the fighting, the constant reminders of humanity's mistakes. The campfire crackled softly, its light spreading across the small clearing Jack had chosen. He had built it carefully, making sure it was big enough to keep the cold at bay, but not too bright to attract unwanted attention. He had learned that lesson the hard way. A few days earlier, he had seen strange shadows moving through the trees in the distance. They were not human. Jack had hidden in the underbrush, his heart pounding, until they had finally moved on. He didn't know what they were, but he didn't want to find out. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to ignore the chill that was settling in the air. The fire was warmth, but it wasn't enough to make him forget that he was on a strange planet, far from home. Jack's thoughts drifted to his past. The wars, the battles, the people he had lost. It all seemed like a different life now. Earth felt like a world away, both in distance and in time. He had joined the military to fight for something, but now he just wanted peace, a simple life, even if it meant being alone. His gaze shifted to the stars again. There were so many of them, more than he had ever seen back on Earth. The light of distant suns made the night sky seem almost alive. It reminded him that there were so many worlds out there, some filled with life, some empty, some peaceful, some at war. Jack thought about Earth, its endless conflicts. He wondered what the world would be like if humans learned to live in peace, but that was a dream he had given up on. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A soft crack of a twig snapping underfoot. Jack's eyes snapped open, his body instantly alert. He turned his head toward the noise, his heart beating faster. In the dim light of the fire, he couldn't see anything, but he was sure he hadn't imagined it. Someone, or something, was out there. His hand instinctively reached for his knife, but he stopped himself. It was foolish to be so quick to react. He needed to stay calm. Maybe it was just a wild animal. He'd seen strange creatures on this planet, but none of them had been dangerous. At least, not yet. Still, the feeling of being watched, the sense of something out there, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Another soft crack. This time, it was closer. Jack squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any movement, but all he saw were the shadows of trees and the faint glow of the fire. The campfire wasn't enough to light up the whole clearing. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew how to stay hidden. Jack slowly stood up, careful not to make a sound. He kept his eyes on the trees, listening for any other movement. The sound had stopped, but his instincts told him something was wrong. He wasn't alone. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was tall and thin, with a shape unlike anything he had seen before. The figure moved closer to the firelight, and Jack's eyes widened in surprise. The creature wasn't human. It was alien. The being wore strange, shimmering clothes, and its face was partially covered by a mask-like helmet. The figure stopped just at the edge of the firelight, staring at him with intense, glowing eyes. Jack's first thought was to grab his knife, but he forced himself to stay still. He couldn't make any sudden moves. The alien woman, if it could even be called a woman, tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Jack noticed her posture was tense, her hand resting on a weapon that looked both unfamiliar and dangerous. She was trying to figure him out, just like he was trying to figure her out. A cold silence stretched between them, neither of them moving. The fire crackled, its warmth a stark contrast to the tense air surrounding them. Jack didn't know what to say, or even if he should say anything. The alien's presence made his heart race, but he forced himself to remain calm. She didn't look like she was going to attack, but he knew that could change in an instant. The woman took a cautious step forward, her glowing eyes never leaving Jack's. She was studying him, much like he was studying her. The tension in the air was thick, and Jack knew that any wrong move could lead to disaster. Suddenly, she spoke. Her voice was strange, a mix of musical tones and harsh sounds. Jack couldn't understand her words, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her voice. She wasn't just observing him, she was warning him. The silence stretched between Jack and the mysterious alien woman. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound breaking the stillness. Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The strange woman in front of him wasn't making any sudden moves, but her posture was tense, ready to act if needed. Her glowing eyes watched him carefully, analyzing every tiny movement he made. Jack's instincts told him to be cautious. His years in the military had taught him to never trust appearances. He slowly took a step back, his hand reaching for his knife. He didn't want to start a fight, but he wasn't about to let this alien approach him too closely either. The woman didn't seem to notice the movement of his hand. She continued to observe him, her body language more curious than threatening. Still, she held her weapon, and Jack wasn't sure if she intended to use it. "Easy," Jack murmured, trying to steady his breath. He didn't want to show fear, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline making his fingers twitch. The woman cocked her head slightly to the side, as if she was trying to understand his words. Her gaze never left him. She stepped forward again, this time much more slowly, her movements deliberate. Jack remained still, his eyes locked onto hers. He was ready to react if necessary. Then, without warning, the alien woman raised her free hand and made a slow gesture toward the fire. It was as if she was pointing to the flames, though her face remained hidden beneath the mask. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of her actions. Was she warning him about something? Or was she trying to communicate? Taking a deep breath, Jack decided to try speaking. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." The woman blinked at him, clearly confused. Her glowing eyes blinked again, her expression unreadable. It seemed like she didn't understand his language, or maybe his words didn't mean anything to her at all. Jack could see the wariness in her body language, but there was no immediate sign of aggression. She hadn't attacked yet. Feeling slightly frustrated, Jack tried again. "Are you looking for something?" His words felt clumsy, but he didn't have much else to go on. The woman didn't answer, but she took another step closer. Jack tensed, preparing himself for a fight, but still, she made no move toward him. Instead, she pointed at the fire again, then back to herself, as if to show him she understood its significance. Jack watched closely, wondering what she meant. Did she think the fire was a threat, or was she simply curious? He couldn't be sure. After a long pause, the alien woman spoke, but her voice was like nothing Jack had ever heard before. It was a mix of soft tones and harsh sounds, completely unintelligible. Her words had a musical quality, but there was something cold about them too. Jack's mind struggled to find any meaning in the sounds. Realizing that communication through language was going to be difficult, Jack decided to try something else. Slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out a ration pack, showing it to her. He wasn't sure if she'd understand, but he offered it to her. "Food," he said, pointing to the pack, and then to himself. I have food if you're hungry. The woman watched him closely, her eyes narrowing as she considered his offer. Jack didn't know if she was offended or just confused. She wasn't exactly jumping to take the food, but after a few tense moments, she reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly. She took the ration pack from him, holding it in her hands without opening it. Her gaze shifted from the food back to Jack, then to the fire. She seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to trust him. But Jack could tell she was hungry, her stomach rumbling softly, even though she hadn't said a word. Slowly, she opened the pack and began eating, but her eyes never left him. Jack watched carefully, still unsure of her intentions. If she was going to attack, this was as good a time as any. But, surprisingly, she didn't. She continued eating, all the while maintaining that unreadable look in her eyes. Jack took this as a small sign of progress. At least she wasn't attacking. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust him a little. "I'm Jack," he said, feeling it was worth trying once more. He gave a small wave, unsure if she would understand, but he tried to introduce himself. "I'm from Earth. I'm not here to hurt anyone." The woman stopped eating for a moment, her eyes still studying him, as if weighing every word. She then looked down at the food in her hands, took another bite, and said something softly in her own language. It was still impossible for Jack to understand, but there was a different tone in her voice now. It was softer, less threatening. She hadn't attacked him yet. That was a good sign, right? Jack hoped so. He had no idea what she wanted or what had brought her to his camp, but for now, it seemed like they might have a chance to communicate. Slowly, cautiously, Jack lowered his guard just a little, but he stayed alert, ready for anything. They might not be friends yet, but this was a start. The fire flickered between them, casting strange shadows over their faces as the night stretched on. There was still so much to figure out, but Jack couldn't help but wonder, what had she seen in the fire that made her approach him? And what was she really after? The fire crackled and popped as the night stretched on, casting shadows across the clearing. Jack sat on a large rock near the edge of the campfire, watching the alien woman as she ate. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if every action had meaning. Jack couldn't stop himself from studying her, trying to understand who she was and why she had come. Her strange appearance still sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't human, that much was obvious. But beyond that, Jack had no idea what to think. The alien woman finished her food quietly, then placed the empty ration pack on the ground. She didn't make any attempt to move closer to Jack, but her eyes stayed on him, studying him just as intently as he was studying her. Her mask-like helmet obscured much of her face, but the faint glow from the fire reflected in her eyes, making them seem almost human. There was a moment of silence between them, and for the first time since their encounter, Jack felt a little less tense. Maybe this was a chance for something more than just survival. Maybe they could understand each other, even if it took time. But then again, Jack couldn't be sure. He had no idea what this alien woman wanted or how to communicate with her beyond basic gestures. And the last thing he wanted was to make her feel threatened again. Jack cleared his throat. "So, what's your name?" he asked softly, trying his best to sound friendly. He wasn't expecting an answer. Her language was so different from anything he had heard before, but it felt like the right thing to say. It was a simple attempt at communication, a small bridge between them. The alien woman didn't answer right away. She seemed to consider his question for a moment, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. Then, to Jack's surprise, she leaned forward and spoke again, her voice low and melodic. The words were strange to him, harsh yet beautiful at the same time, like a song he couldn't understand. Jack felt a small pang of frustration. He had no idea what she was saying. He couldn't help but wonder how he could make sense of her words. They were so different from any language he had heard, and yet there was something oddly familiar about the tone. Jack had been in many difficult situations before, but none quite like this. Communication with someone, or something, so different was a challenge he wasn't prepared for, but he refused to give up. He needed to try, for his own sanity and for the chance to understand what this encounter meant. Jack shifted closer to the fire, moving to sit down cross-legged. He didn't want to seem too distant, but he also didn't want to overstep. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small communication device, hoping it might help. It wasn't much, just a translator he'd used during his military days. It wasn't perfect, but it might work. Jack powered it on, watching as the lights blinked to life. He held it out to the alien woman, who tilted her head in curiosity. "This might help us understand each other," Jack said, hoping the device would work better than his words. The woman slowly reached out, taking the device in her gloved hands. Her fingers brushed lightly over the surface, but she didn't seem to know what to do with it. Jack could see the confusion in her posture, the way she inspected the small gadget. It was clear she had never seen anything like it before. Jack tried to explain further. "It's a device to help translate languages. It can help us talk." He pressed a few buttons on the translator, and a soft voice began to speak in the alien woman's language. The voice was mechanical and awkward, but it was still a start. The alien woman listened, her eyes flickering with what could only be described as curiosity. Then she spoke again, her voice low and musical. The translator didn't pick up anything meaningful, but the tone seemed different. She wasn't angry this time, just confused. Jack's heart raced with the realization that they were not quite there yet. They were still so far from understanding one another, but this small step gave him hope. The woman held the translator closer to her face, as if trying to decipher it. Jack waited patiently, not wanting to push her. If there was any chance of learning what she was trying to say, he needed to be patient. The silence stretched on, but Jack didn't mind. It was a rare moment of peace, and he welcomed it. After a long pause, the woman spoke again. This time, the translator picked up a few words. War, fire, danger. Jack's eyes widened as he heard the words. The fire. She must have thought he was signaling something. Was that why she had come? Did she think the fire was a sign of war? The thought made sense, given her tense demeanor when she first arrived. In many cultures, fire was a symbol of aggression or a call for battle. Jack realized then that this alien woman might have been approaching with caution, not aggression. He leaned forward, trying to calm her down. No, Jack said quickly, shaking his head. "It's not war, just a campfire. I'm alone here." His voice was firm but gentle. "I didn't mean to make you think it was a sign of danger." The woman seemed to listen, her glowing eyes softening a little, though her stance remained guarded. She didn't say anything, but Jack could sense the change in her energy. She was starting to understand, or at least starting to believe him. Jack took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. He wasn't sure where this encounter would go, or how long it would take for them to fully understand each other, but at least they were no longer strangers. The fire flickered as the night stretched on, casting shadows around them both. Jack stared into the flames, lost in thought, while the alien woman sat across from him, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the fire. Neither of them said a word, but for the first time, there was a quiet understanding between them. The night was growing colder, and Jack could feel the chill creeping into his bones. The fire crackled steadily, providing some warmth, but it was clear that the temperature was dropping fast. The alien woman, still sitting across from him, was watching the fire intently. Jack couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Did she miss her home? Did she understand how isolated they both were, alone in this vast wilderness? The silence between them had stretched long enough that Jack was beginning to feel the weight of it. He needed to understand her, to learn what had brought her here, and what she wanted. Was she lost? Was she looking for something? Or was this just a random encounter? Jack had no answers, but he was determined to find them. He glanced at the alien woman, her glowing eyes reflecting the flames. She had barely spoken since that first attempt at communication, and though she seemed more relaxed, there was still an air of caution around her. Jack understood that. He had to tread carefully, especially since she had come to him in such a guarded manner. Taking a deep breath, Jack decided to try again. "I'm Jack," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. "And you? What's your name?" She tilted her head slightly, as if the question puzzled her. Jack saw her eyes flicker to the translator in her hand, but she didn't seem to know how to respond. He felt a pang of frustration, but he quickly masked it. He didn't want to show any sign of impatience. Not now. Jack took another chance and reached into his bag, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. He scribbled down his name and then showed it to her, pointing at the letters as he did. "Jack," he said, then pointed at her, hoping she would understand the gesture. "Your name." She glanced at the notebook for a long moment. Then, to Jack's surprise, she reached for a small device hidden beneath her cloak. The device seemed to flicker and hum with a soft energy, and she pressed a few buttons. After a brief pause, the translator spoke in her melodic voice. "I am Zora." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Zora. Her name was Zora. He smiled softly, repeating the name. "Zora," he said, trying to get the pronunciation right. "Nice to meet you." Zora seemed to react to his smile, her posture relaxing even more. She didn't respond verbally, but her body language indicated a certain level of comfort with him now. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As the fire flickered, Jack leaned back on the ground, stretching his legs out in front of him. Zora followed suit, sitting cross-legged. She kept her distance, but Jack didn't mind. The gap between them had closed slightly. It felt like a quiet moment of understanding was growing, and Jack wasn't about to let it slip away. "Where are you from?" Jack asked, his voice gentle, trying once again to spark a conversation. He wasn't sure how to phrase the question, but he hoped the translator would help. Zora didn't answer immediately, but her eyes narrowed as she stared at the stars above. Jack watched her, waiting. The fire's light danced on the ground, casting long shadows. It was almost as if Zora was thinking deeply about her response. After a long moment, she spoke in her language again, and this time, the translator picked up a few words. "Far away, lost, I seek my people." Jack's curiosity deepened. She was lost. Her people. This wasn't just some random encounter. There was a story behind Zora's arrival, and Jack was determined to understand it. But her words were still so cryptic. What did she mean by seeking her people? Before Jack could ask more, Zora gestured to the forest around them. Her fingers moved through the air in a series of fluid motions, and Jack understood the intent. She was pointing to the surroundings, perhaps indicating her search or the journey that had brought her here. He nodded, showing that he was paying attention. "Your people, are they far from here?" Jack asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. Zora's gaze turned distant as she looked around, her eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't answer right away, but Jack sensed that she was contemplating the question. Maybe the memory of her people brought her pain, or perhaps it made her feel more alone. Jack couldn't imagine what it must be like, stranded in an unfamiliar world with no way of reaching home. Her silence was enough to speak volumes. Jack leaned forward, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'll help you," he said. "If you're looking for your people, I'll help you find them." Zora's eyes flickered back to him, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something in them, a spark of hope, or maybe disbelief. She tilted her head once more, as if evaluating him. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was meaningful. Zora had acknowledged his offer. Jack smiled, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe this was the first step to understanding each other. He didn't know how he could help, or what obstacles they would face. But one thing was certain. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Zora was here, and somehow, their fates had become intertwined. The night stretched on, and the fire continued to crackle in the distance. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. But Jack and Zara sat in silence, two strangers who had crossed paths in an unknown place. But now, as the darkness enveloped them, Jack felt a strange sense of camaraderie. They were both outcasts, searching for something they had lost. And together, they would find it. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Jack woke up. The campfire from the night before had long since burned out, leaving behind only smoldering ashes. He stretched his arms and yawned, looking around. The forest was still quiet, with only the sound of birds beginning to stir. Zora was sitting a little farther from the fire, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharp, almost wary focus. Jack noticed that she had been unusually quiet, lost in her thoughts. He wasn't sure whether it was because of the journey ahead or the memories that still weighed heavily on her mind. He sat up and dusted off the leaves and dirt from his pants. He needed to find out more about Zora's story. If they were going to survive out here and find her people, they needed to understand each other better. Jack decided it was time to ask more questions. "Are you ready to go?" Jack asked, his voice calm but filled with determination. Zora turned to look at him, her glowing eyes meeting his. She nodded, a small but significant movement that Jack took as agreement. She stood up, brushing the dirt off her cloak, and adjusted the strange device around her wrist. "We need to find a way out of the forest," Jack said. "Maybe there's a village or a place where you can get help." Zora's gaze shifted to the dense trees surrounding them. She didn't speak, but Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't trust this place, and Jack understood why. The forest seemed endless, and it felt like they were trapped in its maze, with no clear way out. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed his backpack and stood up, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground. He offered Zora a small smile. "Don't worry. We'll figure this out." With a quiet nod, Zora began to follow him, her movements as graceful as always. Jack had learned a lot about her in the short time they had spent together. Though she didn't speak much, her eyes told him everything. She was strong, intelligent, and determined, qualities Jack admired. As they walked deeper into the forest, Jack's mind raced. Where could they go from here? What were they even looking for? The path ahead was unclear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something important. Zora had come here for a reason. There was a purpose behind her arrival, and Jack was determined to uncover it. They walked for hours, moving through the thick trees and underbrush. Every now and then, Zora would stop, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Jack didn't question her. He knew she had a better sense of direction than he did. He trusted her judgment, even if he didn't fully understand her. Eventually, they came to a clearing, and Jack stopped in his tracks. The forest opened up, revealing a wide, open space filled with tall grass and a winding river in the distance. The air felt fresher here, and Jack could see the sun peeking through the trees, casting beams of light onto the ground. Zora stood next to him, her gaze fixed on the river. She looked as if she was remembering something. For a moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of pain in her expression, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "This is where I came," Zora said, her voice soft and distant. The translator picked up her words, and Jack realized that she was speaking more freely now, her guard coming down slowly. "The river, it leads to my people." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was it. They had found a clue, a sign. The river was their path, the key to finding Zora's people. He couldn't believe it. After all this time, they were finally making progress. "That's great," Jack said, his voice filled with excitement. "We can follow the river. It'll lead us to them, right?" Zora nodded, her face still unreadable. Jack didn't press her for more details. It was clear that Zora's memories were complicated, and he didn't want to push her too hard. She would share what she felt comfortable with, and Jack would be there when she was ready to reveal more. Together, they'd walked toward the river, the sound of the water growing louder as they approached. The water was clear and sparkling in the sunlight, and Jack could see fish darting beneath the surface. He bent down and dipped his fingers into the cool water, feeling the refreshing sensation on his skin. Zara stepped forward, her gaze locked on the river as if it were calling her home. Jack could see the quiet determination in her posture, the way she held herself. She was ready for this next step, ready to move forward and reunite with her people. Jack could only hope that they would find what they were looking for. As they walked along the riverbank, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rise in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. There was still a long way to go, and many challenges ahead, but for the first time since he met Zara, Jack felt like they were on the right path. They continued walking, the quiet flow of the river beside them. Jack kept his eyes on the water, but his thoughts were on Zara. She was no longer the mysterious alien who had appeared out of nowhere. She was his companion, his ally in a strange and unfamiliar world. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey had just begun. The sun was high in the sky as Jack and Zara continued their journey along the riverbank. The path was growing more difficult with each step. The ground was uneven, and the thick trees around them seemed to close in, blocking out some of the sunlight. But Jack didn't mind. He was determined to help Zara find her people, and the challenges they faced only strengthened his resolve. Zara moved with ease through the dense underbrush, her eyes sharp as she scanned the surroundings. She had become more comfortable with him, and Jack could see that she was slowly opening up. She had spoken more during their walk, giving him small details about her journey, though her words were still few. They stopped for a brief rest by the river. The cool water provided some relief from the heat of the day, and Jack took a long drink, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Zara sat down on a rock nearby, her gaze fixed on the river's flow. She seemed deep in thought, her mind somewhere far away. Jack watched her for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "You've been quiet again." Zara turned to face him, her glowing eyes meeting his. She didn't speak right away, but Jack could tell she was considering his question. Slowly, she shook her head, as if the words she wanted to say were trapped inside her. "I'm not used to being so far from home," she said at last, her voice soft but clear. The translator picked up her words, and Jack listened carefully. "The journey is long. I miss my people." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He couldn't imagine what it must be like for her, to be so far from everything she had known, searching for something she wasn't even sure she would find. But Jack was here, and he was determined to help her. "We'll get there," Jack said, his voice reassuring. "We just need to keep going. You're not alone in this." Zara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. But then, she gave a small nod, as if taking comfort in his words. Jack felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The bond between them was growing stronger, step by step. They rested for a while longer, the sound of the river soothing their tired minds. Jack had never been one for long journeys, but with Zara by his side, he felt more capable than ever. She had taught him more than he could have imagined, about survival, resilience, and strength. Eventually, they resumed their walk, the river still guiding them forward. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Jack began to feel a sense of unease. The atmosphere had changed, the air was heavier, and the quiet of the forest seemed more oppressive than before. Zara stopped suddenly, her body going rigid. Her eyes darted around, searching the shadows. Jack instinctively tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Something wasn't right. "Do you hear that?" Zara whispered, her voice low and urgent. Jack strained his ears, trying to pick up any sound. At first, all he heard was the rustling of leaves and the gentle flow of the river. But then, faintly, he caught it. A low growl, like the sound of an animal, but deeper, more menacing. It was coming from somewhere ahead of them. Jack's heart raced. Whatever it wasn't friendly. Zara's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her posture defensive. She seemed to be scanning the area, as if she could sense something more than just the sound. Jack could feel the tension in the air, and his instincts told him that they were not alone. "We need to move," Zara said urgently, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "It's not safe here." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his backpack and started backing away slowly, keeping his eyes on the surrounding forest. The growling sound grew louder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Whatever was out there, it was closing in. Zara moved quickly, staying close to Jack, her steps light and swift. They didn't look back, but Jack could feel the presence behind them. The sound of the growls was getting louder, and they were definitely being followed. Whatever it was not something they could fight off. Jack's mind raced. What could they do? Should they find shelter? Should they keep running? But there was no time to think about it. They had to move, and fast. They reached a small ridge, and Jack spotted a narrow path leading up the slope. Without thinking, he grabbed Zora's arm and pulled her up the hill, urging her to move faster. The growls were now unmistakable, echoing through the trees. Something large and dangerous was on their trail. As they climbed, Jack looked over his shoulder just in time to see a large shadow moving through the trees. His blood ran cold. The creature was massive, its body covered in thick, dark fur, and its eyes glowed with an eerie red light. Jack could only catch a glimpse before it vanished back into the shadows. "Keep moving," Jack shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Zara's pace quickened as they reached the top of the ridge. Jack looked around desperately for a place to hide. There was a small cave nearby, its entrance concealed by thick vines and foliage. Without thinking, he grabbed Zora's arm and pulled her toward it, hoping they could find cover before the creature reached them. As they crouched in the shadows of the cave, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The growls were closer now, echoing through the trees. They were running out of time. The dark, silent cave offered only a small refuge from the terrifying creature that followed them. Jack and Zara pressed themselves into the shadows, hoping the thick vines covering the entrance would hide them from view. The growling from outside was unmistakable, low and menacing, like the sound of something powerful and hungry. Zara's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with fear as she peered toward the entrance of the cave. Jack could feel the tension in her body, but he knew that they had no choice but to stay still and wait. If they moved, they would be spotted. The creature's keen senses would track them down easily. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered, his voice barely above a breath. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. How long would they be able to stay hidden? What if the creature found them here? Zara nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were focused on the entrance of the cave, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Jack couldn't see much from where he sat, but he knew the danger was real. The growling grew louder, and he could hear the creature moving around the cave's entrance, sniffing the air, trying to locate them. For a moment, everything went silent. The growling stopped. Jack held his breath, his muscles tensed, ready to spring into action if necessary. But the silence stretched on, and with each passing second, the tension grew unbearable. What was the creature doing? Suddenly, there was a rustle outside the cave. Then, a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the forest. It was moving away. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. Was the creature leaving? He dared not move, afraid that any noise would alert it to their presence. Minutes passed, and the sounds outside became softer and more distant. Finally, the growling faded completely. Jack slowly exhaled, realizing they had survived, at least for now. "We need to move," Jack whispered, his voice low but urgent. "While it's still gone." Zara nodded quickly, her face pale but determined. She stood up cautiously, glancing toward the entrance to make sure there were no signs of danger. Jack followed her, his senses on high alert. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. Their journey still had to continue. They stepped carefully out of the cave, moving silently and quickly as they made their way deeper into the forest. Jack kept his eyes scanning the surroundings, watching for any signs of movement. The creature could be waiting for them, or there could be others lurking nearby. The danger wasn't over yet, but Jack couldn't afford to waste time. They had to keep moving if they were going to make it to safety. As they walked, Jack noticed Zora's pace was slower than before. She was clearly exhausted, and the constant fear had drained her energy. Jack wasn't much better off. His legs ached, and his mind was racing with worry about the creature that had nearly caught them. But he didn't say anything. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. Zora needed him strong. "We'll find shelter soon," Jack said quietly, trying to reassure her. Just a little further. Zora didn't respond, but she gave him a small nod. She trusted him, and that trust gave him the strength to keep moving forward. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. The forest was dense and difficult to navigate, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across their path. The air was cooling rapidly, and Jack could feel the chill creeping into his bones. But he didn't dare stop. Finally, as the sky turned dark, they spotted a small clearing ahead. Jack's heart lifted. It wasn't much, but it would provide a chance to rest. They moved quickly toward it, finding a small patch of grass where they could settle for the night. Zora sank to the ground, clearly exhausted, but she seemed relieved to have reached a safe spot, at least for now. Jack set up a small campfire, careful not to make too much noise. As the flames crackled, he glanced at Zora, who was staring at the fire, lost in her thoughts. She was still shaken from their close encounter with the creature, but Jack knew they had made it through the worst of it. At least for now. "We'll be all right," Jack said softly, his voice full of confidence he didn't quite feel. "We'll keep moving tomorrow. We just need to rest tonight." Zora looked up at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. There was something in her gaze, something like hope, but also uncertainty. She didn't say anything, but her expression seemed to soften. She was beginning to trust him more, and that meant a lot to Jack. As the night grew colder, they sat in silence, the sound of the crackling fire the only noise in the dark forest. Jack kept his watch, his thoughts drifting back to the danger they had just escaped. But for the moment, they were safe, and that was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Jack was ready. With Zora by his side, he believed they could face anything. Together, they would survive this alien world, no matter what dangers lay ahead. For now, though, they would rest, knowing that they had made it through another day. They had come far, and they weren't going to stop now.